Just going to open up my presentation. So today we're here to talk about ESL placement testing for school admins and teachers. And first I'll do a little overview of what we're going to talk about. I'd like to first go over some of the current methods that schools we're working with are using to determine English proficiency for their incoming students. So go over some of the existing tools that I'm sure you're already using, and we'll briefly touch on some of the limitations that you may be finding. We're also going to talk about what an ELA, an English Language Arts teacher, needs to know about their students' English proficiency when that student is placed into their course, into their class on day one. So, and also more importantly, how we can support those ELA teachers. And we're going to talk about best practices in making a placement decision. So when you're presented with a new student who's coming to your institution who may have ESL needs, some of the best practices in both determining whether that student should be admitted and then how they should be placed into their relevant course streams. So who's this webinar for? This webinar is really for administrators who make admissions decisions. So at the top of the funnel, the administrators who are deciding, should this student first be admitted into our institution, and is taking into account that student's English proficiency when making that admissions decision. Then also administrators can be the same person or it can be a different person who's making the admissions decision, who's deciding, okay, now that we've allowed this student to come into our institution, how do we place them? How do we best place them into a course stream that's going to get them up to their peer streams as quickly as possible? How do we deal with these ESL issues most efficiently? And finally, administrators who are responsible for tracking the student's ESL English proficiency, its advancement, and deciding when that additional support is no longer required and this student is fully up to their peer streams. So for everybody here that is an ESL teacher, so at the end of the day, most administrators that we work with have classroom experience, and often the administrator is still teaching, is still active. So we especially at smaller schools that we work with, we wear multiple hats. So the person who's providing the ESL support is also supporting the admissions and placement and enrollment process up at the top. So if you're an ESL teacher or if you're a part-time ESL teacher, don't worry, this webinar is still going to be relevant for you. But I'd also just like to mention that we have a host of webinars that are specifically targeted towards ESL teachers on our website, Off to Class. And you can just Google Off to Class, OFF2 class webinars. And the first link that will come up in Google is a listing of all our different ESL teacher focused webinars. So certainly have a peek at those if you're still very active in the ESL classroom. Now, a little overview of how English proficiency plays into or works into the admissions and enrollment process. Right at the top, there's usually going to be an assessment of English proficiency when you make the initial admission decision. Then once that admission decision gets made, you're going to use that level of English proficiency to determine whether that student requires additional support when they enter your institution. Then when the student is working through that additional support, you're going to track their progress, and eventually you're going to decide that the student no longer requires this additional support stream and they're fine to just sit in their normal English language arts class and they no longer need English as a second language support. Now, the current methods used to determine English proficiency. So at Off to Class, I work with a number of different institutions. So everything from small private schools to large public schools and entire public school districts. And so as you can imagine, across these different institutions, there's a varying degree of different tools that are already in place that are being used to make that admissions and enrollment and placement decision when an institution is presented with a student with ESL needs. So I'm going to walk through some of these with you and discuss some of their limitations. So many schools require a TOEFL score or an IELTS band to enter their institution. Now, I'm sure most of us here know these two tests. They're the two most popular assessments that are used globally. TOEFL is more American focused, whereas IELTS is more Canada, UK, Australia, rest of the world focused. But both these tests are extremely time consuming and significant undertakings for the students. So both take the entire day to sit, and both cost a significant amount of money, and both have their own framework that you need to learn as the student. So there's a set of exam strategy that you need to understand for TOEFL and then there's a different set of exam strategy that you need to know for IELTS in order to score well on that exam. So it can be very burdensome, expensive, time-consuming. Of course, if your student is still in their home country, if it's an international student, let's say in a smaller community in China or a smaller community somewhere like India, they're going to need to travel to a larger city that actually has a test center to sit this test. It's not a type of test that you can take online. It does require physical presence in a test center to actually take the test. So although it does provide a very understandable band and score that the institution can use and compare to the rubric to understand what that band and score means, it can be a very time-consuming and burdensome process. Many schools we come across use what we like to call an informal mix. So this informal mix usually involves a casual interview where an admissions director, sometimes even a principal. I was working with a school last week here in Australia where the principal actually handled all the interviews. So any student that was coming from an international background or was identified as probably having ESL needs had to have an interview with the principal. And they usually the schools will not just rely on one interview. It will usually be mixed with something like a personal essay or potentially number 3, which I'm going to get into now, self-developed tests. So many schools over the years have developed their own tests. Usually it was a ESL teacher or an academic director at some point in the history of the institution decided that they required their own actual test, and they've developed their own. Sometimes they're online, sometimes they're not. We still come across schools that have paper-based tests, but usually, even if it's an online test, it's usually going to be a very simple kind of web form. Picture a Google form where the student answers a series of multiple choice questions, and then the school usually would manually grade it. Sometimes there's some auto grading worked into that. And then as far as deploying it, collating the results, reassigning it, all those elements, that's really going to be a highly manual process. So the teacher is going to, or the teacher, the administrator is going to have to collect those results, assess them, attach them to the student's file. And then as far as reassigning it, it's usually not going to be an adaptive test. So it's going to be a kind of a one-time only test. And as I was saying, the self-developed test of number 3 usually works into number 2, the informal mix. Now I'd like to talk about how we support ELA teachers who are delivered ESL students on day 1, on week 1 of term. So the reason I wanted to spend an entire section on this is we've been working with a number of private schools lately, and as well as public schools, where it's a relatively small enough institution where the support, the ESL support that is given to the students is provided by English language arts teachers, by English teachers. And so what happens is the ESL student is placed into their normal course stream, so into their grade 9 English class, for example, where the teacher there is not only required to provide the grade 9 English curriculum, but is also required to provide this individual support to the ESL students. Now, of course, sometimes it's a bit of a different setup depending on the institution. Sometimes you'll have a kind of a lunch boot camp or an after school boot camp where the students go and receive direct ESL support, which is fantastic. But either way, the ELA teacher that is providing this has a number of kind of challenges in providing that support. And anything we can do as the institution to support that ELA teacher on day one is going to be very useful. So usually it's not going to be a homogeneous group of ESL students that this ELA teacher is delivered. Each of these students is going to have their own unique needs, because by the time these ESL students come to our institutions, they will have learned English in various paths and places. So they will have learned English at their previous school. They may have gone to a private language institute. They may have gone on a summer travel experience to beef up their English. So they're all going to have different experiences of learning English. And by the time they arrive on our doorsteps, they're all going to have their own unique needs. Not every student, as best as we try to bucket them into like-minded groups, each student is going to have their own needs. So when those students fall on the ELA teacher on day one, what we really need is an understandable proficiency with can-do statements the ELA teacher can use to acclimatize themselves to this student. And these can-do statements, these understandable can-do statements, or any understandable rubric become really important for that ELA teacher to communicate with other teachers, to be able to communicate with history teachers, to be able to communicate with science teachers about what are the reasonable expectations today on day one with this student. Another challenge that the ELA teacher will face is a lack of class time. And we all know that as a reality, that there's only so much class time. And then a final challenge that ELA teacher will face is they might not even have a formal ESL training. So they might not be an ELA, they might not have a lot of experience dealing with ESL needs. And other things we can do to support that ELA teacher is that we can provide a starting point to address possible weaknesses. So if we can provide a profile for that student to the ELA teacher with a number of starting points of where you would begin with that student, and those starting points are going to be different than the starting points for the student sitting next to him. If we can provide on an individual student basis specific starting points to address possible weaknesses, it's going to be hugely helpful for that ELA teacher on day one. And then, of course, where should we focus? Where, what skills does this student need the most help in? Is it grammar, reading, listening, writing, speaking, or a mix of all of those? So now we're going to jump into best practices for placement testing, and I'm going to pass over to Chris Rush.
Fantastic. So I just want to make sure, starting off, that everyone can see me and everyone can hear me. So if someone wouldn't mind putting something in the chat box.
Yeah, looks great, Chris.
Okay, fantastic. So what I'd like to do is talk about, at this point, get into the meat. And the meat being, in order to design a placement test or an onboarding process that's going to be effective for all students, we've laid out 9 key points. And we've laid out these 9 key points in the form of a challenge and what the solution could be. So these come under kind of 3 separate umbrellas. The first umbrella is applying a consistent test to all students, which has 3 distinct challenges. Number 1, how to test consistently yet accommodate different levels. So if you're going to try to make sure that everyone is taking a consistent test and has a consistent experience, how do you accommodate for, you have students at all levels, so you've got beginners all the way up to advanced. Do you do a paper test? How do you do that? How do you make sure that everyone's going to have a consistent testing experience that gets all their skills. The solution is to have a test that will actually adapt. So depending on whatever the student's level is, to design a test that will work for everyone no matter where they fall on the spectrum. Okay, let's look at the next challenge. How to measure progress and determine improvement. So part of the issue with this is you can have a test that's great, an onboarding process that's great, but then the only thing you ever use it for is when a student is new. How then do you measure their abilities as they enhance? And then how do you know when they are ready to kind of join the main curriculum? How do you know, are they ever at a point where they're going to graduate from the second language curriculum? So if you have a test that not only serves as an onboarding tool, but then can also be used to measure the progress and measure it in a different way, but at the same time testing the same skills, then it's something that you can use more than once. And then the third challenge with consistency is making sure that you test every skill. So it's fine to test grammar. Grammar is a starting point. There are lots of online tests for free that will give someone a basic grammar test. But how do you go beyond grammar? How do you make a test that will cover the four essential skills of language: speaking, listening, reading, and writing, all in one comprehensive test that gives you an overall idea of the student's abilities? So these three key practices: having a test that adapts, having it make sure that it tests the same skills with different questions, and then tests all four key language skills in addition to grammar, that's what we're looking for when we're designing tests that are going to meet this consistency criteria. Okay, let's move on to another best practice. One of the things that we see over and over again when we talk to educators who are working on their onboarding process is the problem with logistics. And Chris mentioned this before, between you've got IELTS on the one hand, and then you've got these inconsistent principles somewhere in the middle. How do you handle the logistics of this? And it comes down to very simple things. Number one, where do you take this test? Is it something that you need a computer lab for? Is it something you have to have equipment for? So the idea here is that in order for the test to be as effective as possible, you want to have something that can be taken from anywhere, whether that's on site, whether it's from a dorm room, or even if it's part of the admissions process that a student can take in another country, in the home country if it's an international student. So something that is flexible enough that can be done from anywhere. Let's look at another logistical challenge. Okay, how to administer an accurate test to a student with limited ability to read English instructions. So if you've got this adaptive test, well, how can you feel confident giving this to people who, for everyone, English is their second language, and they're going to be at varying degrees of ability? Well, the solution to that is to find a test or design a test that has instructions in whatever the student's language is, one that can be translated into many languages, which, if you have that, then that's something that you don't have to worry about. And finally, let's look at the third logistical challenge: how to accommodate students with limited computer availability. So it's fine if you've got a test that you can take anywhere. Well, that's great, but not everyone around the world has access to a computer at all times. So the ideal test is one that can be taken not only anywhere at any time, but with any internet-enabled device. With the proliferation of smartphones and tablets all over the world, as something that, as long as the student has an internet device with a connection, they can take this test. So let's move on to our last three set of best practices, and that's how do we ensure accurate results? So number one, cheating. It's just kind of an academic reality, and how do we minimize this? Well, there's a couple of ways that you could minimize cheating on the placement test. Number one is if you have questions that are original, not questions that were sourced from anywhere. Questions that if you pasted them into Google are not going to yield any results. That's number one. The second thing is if you don't have is if you're going to test the students speaking, that the results are coming in the student's real voice. So that no matter what, when they're taking the test, they're going to have to be doing it in their voice. Okay, the second thing to ensure accurate results is accommodating discrepancies in grammar and language production. So you may have this happen. I'm sure lots of teachers have been in the situation where you've got a student who can do excellent on a written grammar test, but when it comes to speaking, when it comes to writing and actually producing the language, that's where the difficulties pop up. So the ideal is to have a test that not only can determine what a student's grammatical strengths and weaknesses are, but a test that also forces them to produce the language, and not just on a written level, but actually forces the student to speak. So combining the convenience of a test that can be taken anywhere with the test that's versatile enough that they're going to use their own voice, so that as an administrator, you know exactly where the student stands before you ever meet them. Okay, finally, the last best practice: clear instructions. Okay, this is something that's completely understated. Having a test that provides clear instructions that explain the timing and the flow of every single part of the test. So something that's just tremendously important for making sure that you've got that consistent, accurate result is making sure that for all these different parts of the test that are working in concert, that they're going to work together through clear instructions. Okay.
Great, Chris. So I'm going to quickly jump into a overview of some of the tools we use here at Off to Class to conduct placement testing. So I'm going to just quickly share my screen again. Great, so we'll just let that load up. So myself and Chris are from a company called Off to Class. We provide an ESL toolkit for teachers and schools. And one of the most popular elements of our tool is our placement test. And given the subject of today's webinar, that's what I'm going to focus on today. So I'm logged into my Off to Class account as a teacher or as an administrator. Lots of administrators take on teacher accounts to run the administration of these placement tests. And I'm actually in the process of sending a new test to my student, Carlos. So you can see the green button down here says send test to Carlos. And I'm in the process of deciding which competencies I'd like to include in Carlos's test. So every time I add a competency, whether it be listening, reading, writing, or speaking, on the right here, I, as the administrator, have clear instructions of what exactly is going to happen on Carlos's side when he answers this section of the test. Will he be able to save and come back later? Will it be timed where once he starts the section, he will only have a certain amount of time to complete it? All that drill sheet for me is on the right. And of course, when I choose to send this test to Carlos, all of these instructions are delivered to him prior to taking the test. When he goes to log in and take that test, he's delivered all these instructions in a very clear and understandable manner. And I also, when I set up Carlos as a student, I had the choice of whether to use a student interface language. So that is whether I want to translate the interface of the system into the student's native language. And we have about 15 different languages that you can choose depending on your student's native language. And it's very helpful, especially when often when you just don't know. You don't know, well, you may not have even had your interview yet with Carlos, and you just don't know what his level of English is. So playing on the safe side, I may have already translated Carlos's interface language into Spanish, for example, not knowing what level of English he has. And of course, this is an English test. The questions are going to be in English. We're testing his English proficiency, but we don't want to hamper those results because Carlos wasn't able to read the instructions in English. He wasn't able to understand that the send button was actually the save button, and so on. So it's just the interface that we're translating. So I'm going to send this test to Carlos, and then Carlos is going to be prompted to log in on an internet-connected device and take the test. And just for sake of brevity, I'm going to open up another student's results here to walk you through them. So this is my student, Jose, and he took the test a little while back. And I'm going to walk you through his results. So this is what I receive as the administrator when my student completes a test, one of our tests here on Off to Class. So I can see that Jose sat all the sections. He sat grammar, listening, reading, writing, and speaking. And I'm going to walk you through each of the competencies and what were delivered as the school. So up here, I've got his grammar proficiency level. And this is based on the Council of Europe's rubric, the CEFR. So we provide a matrix that compares what the CEFR represents and what that level represents into other world standards. But it's quite simple. So roughly a C1 equates to an upper intermediate. But more important or more useful than the overall grammar proficiency level is I have a number of can-do statements here that are written in clear, non-technical language that I can use to start to form that picture of what this student can and can't do. And I can start applying that to other subjects, not just English, but also what the student can and can't do within other subjects, within math, within science, and within history, for example. And I can use these to communicate to all of the students' teachers, not just necessarily the teacher the ELA teacher or the teacher that's been tasked with providing ESL support. So this is quite useful on the overall picture that I'm trying to build with this student. In addition, for the grammar, we've got what we call a gap analysis. And this is really all about the starting points with this student. So we've got, for every question that the student answered incorrectly, we've got the question laid out for us, we've got what the student put, and what the right answer is. And most importantly, we've got the lesson from our content library that you'd use to deal with that deficiency. So in this case, Jose is tracking his overall grammar proficiency is tracking at a C1, which is an upper intermediate, yet he's displaying all these A1 and A2 issues. And this really speaks to the fact of what we were discussing earlier, that every student is different. Every student is, by the time they land on our doorsteps, is going to have learned English in a number of different experiences, and they're all going to have their own unique issues. And using this gap analysis that we provide you in the results, you're going to be able to get an understanding of the unique issues and challenges that this student is facing. So Jose has a number of beginner and elementary issues. And likely what the ELA or ESL teacher is going to do on day one is use this as the starting point. Because if my student is overall tracking at an upper intermediate, but is making errors with subject pronouns, with the present simple, with this, that, these, those, then these are obviously the issues I'd like to rectify first. And I have the ability to provide that individual attention at the individual student level because I'm armed with this gap analysis. So as I was saying, I can actually, as the teacher, launch any of these lessons that I know the student is struggling with based on their gap analysis just by clicking on one of them. So I'll click on this one. And right away, the system asks me if I want to enroll Jose into the lesson. And I'm inside the lesson content to deal with this deficiency that was displayed in the gap analysis. So I've got the lesson content on the right and the teacher notes on the left. This is, of course, from the teacher's perspective. We're not going to get into the mechanics of actually using our tool to teach the lessons today. So we're really focusing on the placement testing, but just so that you know that all these lessons that are displayed in the gap analysis can be used as a starting point by the teacher to actually start addressing these deficiencies. Now, when it comes to the listening and reading proficiency, these are auto-graded. So the listening proficiency and the listening portion and the reading portion are comprehension-based. where the student answers a number of multiple choice questions for the listening based on an audio excerpt and for the reading based on a text. Now, these questions are being driven, the level of these questions are being driven off how the student scored in the grade. So we're going back and we're saying, okay, the student has a C1 upper intermediate grammar proficiency, but does the listening support that? When the students provided listening comprehension questions at the C1 level, are they able to actually support that grammar proficiency level? And same goes with reading. And we tell you here whether the student's listening score or reading score supports or does not support the grammar proficiency level. And again, for the ELA teacher who's trying to build a profile on day one, this is hugely helpful. Should I be focusing on listening? Should I be focusing on reading? And generally, who is this student and what does the profile look like? Now, on the writing and the speaking proficiency, we don't actually provide an auto grade. And the reason for that is we want to build a profile of this student. So what we do for the writing and both the speaking is we provide a graded question, again, being driven off the grammar proficiency, where the student writes from their own perspective and speaks from their own personal perspective. And for the speaking portion, we actually provide you the recording of the student speaking, which, you know, Chris Rush earlier mentioned about cheating and that using the speaking and having the student record their own voice can be a great way of kind of minimizing that. But cheating aside, having the student record themselves and write from their own perspective really helps build the profile of the student and helps us understand as educators who this student is, what some of their own personal perspectives might be, and how their speaking ability and writing ability plays into the overall ESL picture of the student. Now, the final thing I'll mention is that you can actually print these results and you can actually print an achievement certificate of these results for your student, which can go a long way to motivation and speaks to tracking and motivating and, you know, the end goal of eventually getting the student out of their core streams, their core ESL support streams. So that was most of what I wanted to show you around our tool today. We hope that you all enjoyed the presentation. What I'm going to do now is, for any follow-on, rather than getting into a Q&A here where everybody's going to have their own questions, because let's face it, everybody's institution is a little bit different, and how our tools or our best practices might fit into your institution is always going to be specific to you, specific to your school or your university. And so what we'd recommend now is, if you'd like to book a one-on-one strategy session with my team, with Chris, you should see a big red button on your side right now that says book a strategy session. And what happens if you press that button, you'll be taken to Chris's calendar and you'll be able to book a one-on-one session with him where you can meet up and discuss your own institutional needs with Chris. And we can go from there as far as finding a way to work with each other. So I'm going to end now. We really would recommend booking an individual strategy session if you liked any of the content in today's session. And we look forward to hearing from you. Goodbye.